of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun, it shall never go down. There are evergreen trees that blow in the breeze, and their fruitage is brighter than gold. There the throne of God stands in the fairest of lands, and nothing.
We are in the Gospel of Mark, as we've talked before. We are in section 1, and we are still in the first part of section 1. Section 1 is, I'm basically breaking it up into, yes.
I put Galilee and Mark 1:29.
Okay, I have 34 as the primary thing that I want to talk about to begin with this morning. It is somewhat important, verses 28 and 29, in connection with what I want to talk about. So we will actually start by reading those two verses. It says, they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. And so what's taken place here, we'll recall, is the baptism of Jesus was recorded, the temptation of Jesus was recorded. Very short order, those things are 2 verses. His ministry begins. He calls his first disciples, and he heals the man with the unclean spirit. People take note. And what the language that's used here is a new teaching with authority. That's what we talked about quite a lot last week, is the difference between the way Jesus taught and the way men teach. And it was recognized. And then he demonstrated that authority by casting out this unclean spirit, and that made an impression upon those who heard him. He was not just one claiming authority, he was one who had authority. And so they began to talk about him. It says his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. And so that whole northern part of the land of Israel becomes the scuttlebutt at the well. Hey, did you hear about this guy back here who did this? My neighbor saw it with their own eyes and told me about it. And those kinds of things were taking place. So verse 29 says that he leaves the synagogue. We'll recall that a bunch of people come to the house, and he begins to heal a lot of people after the Sabbath. And then it says this: he cast out many demons. This is verse 34, the end of verse 34. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. Okay, we want to start with that last phrase first. What does it mean when it says they knew him? Okay, they knew specifically that he was Christ, that he was God with us, that he was not merely human. They knew. And so when it says because they knew, what does that word mean? How is it significant to what's being talked about here?
Could it be that he wanted the others to listen to him and believe without believing demons?
Okay.
That he is the Christ.
That is a extremely common scholarly argument. By the way, this isn't the first time it mentions it in chapter 1. I think it's back in verse 25, if memory serves me correct. He healed a man with the unclean spirit in the synagogue. And I think it's in verse 25. Let's see. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent," and come out of him. And so what had been happening is he said, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us?" And Jesus says, "Be quiet." So he doesn't want them to say any more than what they've said there. And then now again, he casts out demons and he tells the demons, keep silence. And the word because is significant in as much as it gives the reason. This is the reason why he said to them, don't say anything. The reason why is because they knew him. And so that's what we want to talk about. Why would he not want them to testify if they knew? And as was suggested, the most popular explanation is that Jesus did not want the testimony of lying spirits, of those under the direction of the father of lies, to be bearing testimony about him, that would be counter-effective for his purposes. And I think that's reasonable. I'm not absolutely convinced myself yet that that's at least the only reason. What other thing might we consider? And I'll kind of prompt you by reminding you that we do know the very first miracle that he worked. Anybody remember what that was? Turning the water into wine, recorded in John chapter 2. It tells us in that context, this is the first of his miracles which he performed. What did he say to his mother when she came to him looking for help? It's not my time. And what we see, I believe here, is that Jesus is in control of the revelation. He is wanting people to know as much as he is telling them. He is building a foundation. He is preparing people to receive him. And had he just run out into the middle of the street and yelled at the top of his voice, "Hey, I'm God, you need to listen to me," what would people think? Okay, what would you think if I ran into the room yelling, "Hey, I'm God, you have to listen to me"? You would think I'd lost my mind. That's what you would think. That's what they would have thought about him as well. That is not the way that you go about persuading someone of something. The way you persuade someone of something is you teach them in foundational blocks that build upon one another until they can see the whole picture. Nobody does that more in this room than probably Wesley, who teaches one of the most complicated subjects known to man: music theory. I promise you, if you went into his third-year music theory class, not having been exposed to fundamental music theory, you would think he was speaking in a foreign tongue. It is very, very planned and careful what's introduced, when it's introduced, how it's introduced, so that it can be understood. If Mr. Bruce started talking to us the way that he talks to the directors of the salt mine in mining techniques, we would not have a clue what he was talking about, and it would mean nothing to us, and we would learn nothing. If he was going to talk to us about mining, he would have to start off at very basic conversation. And so you got to understand, this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It's not yet time for some of these things to be said. And he's controlling the message, and he's controlling the timeline. And how long did he do that, by the way? All the way through. You'll remember one of the last things he said to the 12. By the way, there were 3 of the 12 that got more information than the rest of the 12, and all of the 12 got more information than the rest of the world. And you'll remember one of the last things he said to the 12 was, there are many more things I have to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. So I'm going to leave, and I'm going to send back the Spirit of truth, and he's going to reveal these things to you at the appropriate time, essentially is what he's telling them. You can't bear this now. And so it was very carefully laid out so that man could understand it and accept it. Even his death itself. There are times when he hides. I'm going to use that term. I don't know that the Bible actually ever uses that particular word, but he hides from the people who are coming to get him. And then when it's time, he stands out in public and tells his disciples not to resist them. He controlled when he was arrested and when he went to the cross, and even controlled when his spirit left his body. He was in control the whole entire time. He is in control here. And what we are actually seeing is yet again his natural authority over all things. When he said to these demons, you can't speak. Do you notice the way it's said here in this phrase? He would not permit the demons to speak. You know what that means? They had to have permission from him to talk about those things. There's something to learn in that as well. Do we need to establish authority from God before we teach? Do we need to establish authority of God before we act? Do we need to establish authority from God before we worship? And the answer is yes. We need to be permitted to do the things that we do, because all authority rests in him. And it always has. And the demons understand that, so they were not permitted to speak because they knew him. So he doesn't let them speak because they're likely to say things that it's not yet time for. As some suggest, maybe it would destroy his work if evil spirits and demons are running around blurting out things. I'm tending to not believe them. And so that may be part of it as well. And then the other part of it is, it's just a demonstration of his authority over them. No, you can't speak. And they don't have a choice at that point. And when James writes about the demons, he says that even the demons do what? Even they believe and tremble. They respect God. Why do they respect God? Because they know his authority. At one point, I think it's in John 8, I could be wrong on the gospel, but at one point he is talking about the things that he does, and there are people saying that he has acted by some other authority. And he said, look, I can't do anything except the Father allows it. In other words, he's saying God has to permit for things to be done. That's across the board. And what that does mean, by the way, just to I guess, run off on a tangent trail for just a moment, is that the things that men do and say, we've been given permission to exercise our will and to do what we will desire to do. Just because we're permitted to do that, does that make it right? No. What the test is for you and I is not whether we can do something. What the test is whether we should do something. And I'll even carry this one step further. You'll recall that Paul, when he wrote to the church at Corinth, I believe it is, he told them that lawful things, he says, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not profitable. They don't edify. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. In other words, I'm not controlled by the things that I can do. I control what I do so that men may be edified. There's the test. That's what God has set up for us, is the test. He's allowed us to do more than what is right, and then told us what? These are the limits you need to live by. To see if we're willing to do what? If we're willing to choose to acknowledge his authority. Which is why Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. It's also why when Jesus had that interaction with the Roman centurion, the centurion gives that long speech about authority and says, hey, I understand how authority works. I understand that there are people who have authority over me and they tell me what to do and I have to do it. And I have authority over these other people and I tell them what to do and they have to do it. And I know that you have authority and all you have to do is say the word and my servant will be healed. And Jesus' response is, I've not seen such great faith in all Israel. From a discussion about authority, it all goes back to understanding the resident authority in the divine. And he had that authority and he did not permit them to speak, so they did not speak. And the reason he didn't permit them to speak, as I read this, is because they knew him and it wasn't yet time for these things to be said and revealed. He was in control of what men knew. Rising early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. What time did he get up? That's a great answer, but that doesn't. Who knows what time the sun came up that day in Israel? I have no idea. What's the point? That's what we need to be asking ourselves. Okay, I'm sure there were some people awake, but a lot of people were still asleep. And he purposefully rose and went to a desolate place. If you're reading the King James, does it say desert place? Yeah, solitary place. That's okay. Yeah. He went to be alone, found a place early in the morning where he could be alone, and he prayed. Look, this is nothing but an example. That's all this is. Of what one who serves the Father looks like. And when his fame is spreading, he doesn't go out to the masses and fan the flames and enjoy the accolades. He actually goes by himself and does what? Prays. What's he pray about? We're not actually told here exactly what he prays about. I'll just say it's between him and God. But he prayed. And what we see is that even the Son of God relied upon prayer to face the challenges of living as a man on this earth. And I desperately fear that we do not put enough stock in prayer. We don't pray enough. We don't purposefully pray enough. We don't find time and find places to do it. And that's exactly what he's doing here. He gets up very early in the morning and he finds a place where he can be alone and actually open up to the Father in devoted prayer. And we would be in much better places, I believe, if that is the way that we lived our life. If we purposed and planned it. By the way, he's not the only one that lived that way. Daniel lived that way. He had 3 times a day that he made the opportunity to pray. We need to consider these kinds of things. Simon and those who were with him searched for him. See, he even left the 12. Well, it wasn't the 12 at that point yet. But that small group of disciples that he had already amassed unto himself, he left them, didn't tell them where he was going. They're looking around for him. And they found him and said to him, everyone is looking for you. I would submit that there is a good chance that that is exactly why he went and found a solitary place to pray. He was trying to distance himself from those crowds. There are other times that he did that very thing, and we know he did that very thing when the crowds were pressing up against him. He went off to the mountain to pray. When the crowds were pressing against him, he went into a boat and went to the other side and ran from the other across the sea from them. He said to them, let us go on to the next towns. Okay, so they come and they say, hey, all these people back in the city, they're looking for you. And he says, let's go to the next place, that I may preach there also. Now, do you notice where the focus is in the ministry of Jesus? It's on the teaching that he's doing. It's on the preaching, the proclamation of the message. It wasn't about the miracles. The miracles were about the message. He didn't say, let me go to the next town so I can work miracles there and work everybody up into a tizzy. He says, let me go into the next town so I can preach to those people too. For that's why I came out. Why did Jesus come out? To preach. He went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. Now, he didn't just cast out demons. That's a contrast. And the purpose for which he did it then is the same purpose for which he did it when this section of Mark started, to demonstrate the authority of his teaching, so that people could believe the message. A leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling, said to him, if you will, you can make me clean. Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will be clean. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once, and said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest, offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them. But he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. This is an interesting little exchange here, and there's so many little things that could be talked about and that I want to talk about, but I don't want to lose the bigger picture, and I certainly don't want to lose the arc of Mark's gospel here. So I'm going to try not to get into the details too much. But understand, leprosy was wasn't any worse then than it is today, but it was a particularly problematic thing. It was a particularly hated thing. It made someone unclean. And that's part of the significance of why it talks about him cleansing lepers rather than healing lepers. It's not about the leprosy so much. I mean, what I mean by that is it's not really the leprosy that he's trying to show that he has the ability to clean. It's actually the sin from their soul that he wants people to understand that he can clean. And he's wanting to show people that he has this power. Listen, if you could say to someone who is terribly afflicted with leprosy, be clean and they're healed, you've got a lot of power. Listen, we get impressed with doctors who could give us medicine, or who can take a knife and cut us open and work on our parts and bring us to some measure of wholeness when they're done. We get impressed with them. And by the way, they also get what? What do we call it? One of the biggest afflictions against doctors. They get a God complex. They start going, hey, I've got the power of life and death. They start thinking that they have the authority of God sometimes. Well, Jesus had that authority, and he was using this mechanism to prepare people for him saying, I can forgive your sins. And you'll recall that one instance that we studied about not too long ago where he did say to someone, your sins are forgiven you. And what did people do in response to that? They got mad at him. And he said, well, which is easier to say, rise and walk, or your sins are forgiven? I've already showed you the authority that I have. Now I'm just showing you what I really want to apply it to. What I really want to do is forgive your sins. And so that's part of what we need to understand from this exchange. Also, moved with pity. That's an important part of this revelation. It's not just an incidental note. Have you noticed that Mark isn't talking about incidental things? I mean, his baptism is verse 9 and 10 and 11. The whole ordeal is discussed in what, 3 sentences? The temptation to Jesus, even shorter, in 2 sentences. He's not talking about a lot of stuff, and so what's there is there for a reason. And what we're getting a picture of is a picture of a God who has compassion and pity on men, who understands their circumstances, who desires to help them. And one of the most significant things is because of that pity, Jesus, it says, reaches out and touches him. Now, what did the Jews believe about touching a leper? It made them unclean. And Jesus is showing that there are some things that are more important. That supplying comfort and encouragement and hope is more important. You remember that whole discussion about the Pharisees that parsed out their thyme and their mint and their cumin and tithed all those tiny little spices, just gave their 10%, which, by the way, I'm not real sure that I'm not going to say. I'm just going to, we'll let it stand the way it was presented in the Bible. That's what they were doing. And he says, you strain at a gnat and you swallow camels. You're paying attention to these minuscule things, but the weightier matters of love and justice and righteousness, those things you're ignoring. That's not how Jesus lived. Jesus lived as one who got up early in the morning before anybody else got up and found a quiet place so he could pray. And he's one who had pity upon those who were hurting and wanted to comfort them and aid them. He didn't have to touch this man. He didn't even have to be in the city with this man to cleanse him of his leprosy. He touched him to show compassion and to teach. That touch was an act of teaching. Sometimes, in order to help people, you got to touch them. Even if it means that your hand gets dirty. You got to touch them. Jesus sternly charged him, verse 43 says. Send him away at once. What was his stern charge? The exact same thing that he told the demons. Don't say anything about this. And then he says something else to him. He says, instead, you go to the temple, you present yourself to the priest, you do everything that Moses commanded. That was a whole process, by the way. There was a whole process you had to go through. You had to be tested before you could be declared clean. And notice the reason why he tells him to go through that process. Go show yourself to the priest, offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for proof to them. In order for this to be any good, they have to know what happened here. But instead, he went out and began to talk freely about it. Here's a frightening thing. Here's your first-class example in the Bible that just because you've been forgiven and cleansed doesn't mean that you're going to follow the commands of Jesus. Sternly commanded him, don't say a word. Go do what the law of Moses commands you to do. Instead of doing that, he does the exact opposite. Yes, we can do that. We can go into the waters of baptism. We can be raised in newness of life. We can walk out the door and then start exercising our own will and ignoring what God commands. You would think that he would be grateful for what Jesus just did. And that gratefulness would be manifested through what? Through obedience. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. But the circumstances overwhelmed him. He wasn't walking by faith, he was walking by sight. He'd been healed, he was excited. He wanted to tell people. Now we're not told his motivation, but he thought within himself, clearly, that people needed to know that he was helping Jesus by telling them everything freely. Well, this guy comes up to me and he touches me and he tells me to be cleansed and I'm healed of my leprosy and I need to tell you about this. And Jesus had just told him, that's not what I need from you. What I need from you is obedience. Jesus could no longer openly enter a town. This becomes a barrier to Jesus' ability to do what he wants to do. Do you remember when the disciples searched him out when he was praying early in the morning? And they said, hey, all these people are looking for you, which clearly the inference is that they're saying, hey, these people are looking for you. We need to go back. And Jesus says what? No, I need to go to the next towns and I need to preach in those places. He can't do that anymore. He could no longer openly enter a town. You remember, well, some of you, most people in this room, there's a few back there that can't. Remember the 60s and 70s and Elvis Presley. In the stories of Elvis Presley, which essentially are this, He never left his house in the daytime. He went and did things overnight, and he would rent facilities, amusement parks, entire buildings. When he would travel and stay at a hotel, he would rent the entire hotel at times. Because of the crowds that would amass, he couldn't just openly go somewhere. That's what's happening to Jesus. He can't just openly walk into town. He's now got to secret himself into places, which makes it a whole lot harder for him to do the very thing that he wants to do, which is what? Preach to everyone. He wants to be able to preach to everyone, but now he can't do that because there are people crowding around him wanting things from him other than his teaching. Yes?
I have a feeling that Jesus wanted this to knew that this was going to take place, because if everybody obeyed him and went to the Jews and did everything under the law of Moses, and the Jews accepted his testimony, then he would never have been crucified.
Well, to the first part of what you said, I think you're absolutely right about your feeling that he knew what was going to happen, because God knows the end from the beginning. But that doesn't mean he wanted it to happen. What does he want of man? Obedience. It would be great. By the way, well, no, I won't get into that. I'm just going to say this. His knowing what would happen doesn't change his command. And it doesn't change the effect. And the thing that I take away from this is that when I don't obey God and I don't do things the way he commands me to do them, and instead I replace it with a way that I think will be better, that I'm not helping him, I'm impeding him. I'm not enabling his work to be done, I'm preventing it from being done. And there's the big lesson in this. If I don't want to be a block to men being able to hear the preaching, then I need to be careful to obey and do exactly what I'm told. Because there's a way that seems right, and it seems like it's a good thing to me, and hey, who can argue about fame? I mean, fame's great. And Jesus is going, actually, I don't want that. I want to be able to talk to people. That's what I want. I want to be able to go into a place and talk to people so that I can help people by telling them the things that they need to know, by teaching them what I know. And when we don't do exactly what he has instructed us to do, then we impede that. By the way, that's exactly what Paul is arguing to the church at Corinth. Exactly. When they are abusing the spiritual gifts that they had. And he said, look, when you behave the way that you're behaving, outsiders and unbelievers are going to come in and they're going to think you've lost your mind. That's counterintuitive to the mission, which is to edify people. And so everything needs to be done for edification purposes, for teaching, for building up, for instructing. And in anything that we do that impedes that part of, and again, I go back to the end of verse 38. Let us go into the next towns that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out. That's the whole purpose of his beginning to minister to man, was to preach the message. And then he charged his disciples to go into all the world and preach to every creature. And then by the time we get to 1 Timothy, we're told that the church is to be the pillar and support. Or is that 2 Timothy? Anyway, one of the letters to Timothy. To be the pillar and support of the truth. That's the main focus, is the message. And that's what we have to help people understand. Anybody have any questions or comments I'm out of time. Hopefully, this has been a profitable discussion for everyone. I don't want to get bogged down so much that we miss the bigger picture, so I'm going to try to move a little more quickly as we go forward. But I don't want to miss important things either. So it's a balancing act. Appreciate your presence and your...
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun